Do you ever feel like whenever there's a difficult situation or a hard situation, you get very anxious or like you have this underlying anxiety? Or do you feel that when things get hard or difficult or uncomfortable, you tend to get negative or maybe you have negative thoughts? If this is you, I want you to know that number one, you're not alone. Number two, it's not your fault. And number three, there's nothing wrong with you. We humans evolved this way. Hi, I'm Meli, and today I wanted to share with you a little bit about what I've been studying and doing research on in regards to how our brain and our mind work and how it evolved this way. And if you've been with me for a while, you know, and if not, I'll tell you that part of my mission is to teach you about the ancient wisdom of yoga because I believe it's so powerful, but also combined with modern day science. So I've been reading this book here called Buddha's Brain, and it's the practical neuroscience of happiness, love, and wisdom. And I found it, a lot of the things that are in here, fascinating, but today I just wanted to focus on what I just spoke about a little bit, how our brain and our minds evolved to be vigilant and anxious and have this negativity bias. And negativity bias is like negative events usually tend to have more impact over positive ones, like they tend to be stored in our mind more than positive. So it really takes an effort to bring out the positive instead of the negative. And this being vigilant and anxious is what sometimes causes us, to have this underlying anxiety or to get anxious whenever there's an uncomfortable situation or a difficult situation. And it's just part of how we evolved. And the main thing about this book is it mentions like if you can change your brain, you can change your life. Or if you can change your mind, I guess, as well. Brain and mind are interconnected. You can change your life. And I find that very powerful. And what's interesting and more powerful is to make any problem better. Obviously, you need to understand its cause, right? And when you understand why or the cause, it is that you either feel like nervous or anxious or annoyed or whatever that uncomfortable feeling that you feel. Whenever you understand its cause, that feeling kind of loses power over you. So that's why this is so important. So in order to pass on their genes, our animal ancestors had to choose correctly many times how to either approach something, either like food or an opportunity, and how to avoid things like a threat to survival, right? And we became, like our brain became more built towards avoiding than approaching. And that is because the negative experiences instead of the positive experiences were the ones that had the most impact in our survival, right? So imagine back in the day when you're like out in the wild and there's threats to your survival, like life and death threats to your survival all the time. Of course, we evolved to be vigilant and anxious and always like looking out, are we, if there a threat to our survival, are we going to have to, fight or flight, right? The fight or flight response to that threat that is threatening our life. So the authors, who are actually neuroscientists, explain that negative experiences became more prevalent because of the impact on our survival. But because, like, for example, if our animal ancestors were unable to avoid a threat, like an attack from a predator, obviously they didn't survive. So the ones that were more vigilant, more anxious, and able to avoid those threats from predators and survive, then they were able to reproduce and pass on their genes. And as the book explains, here I'll read it to you. So our animal ancestors, the ones that lived to pass on their genes, they paid a lot of attention to these negative experiences, right? So now, fast forward to today, when you're awake and not doing anything, the baseline resting state of our brain activates this default network, and one of its functions seems to be like tracking your environment and body for possible threats. So this basic awareness is often accompanied by a background feeling of anxiety that keeps you vigilant. So, and the book says we became anxious for good reason. There was a lot to fear. And there was a lot to fear back then. And this way that we evolved, like sometimes, I don't know if you'll notice, whenever there's a threat to your well-being, whether it's like something that you want to achieve, right? Maybe it's not a life or death threatening thing that's happening, but sometimes it does feel that way to us, right? In the moment, it feels like life and death, even though it's not. And we also develop this negativity bias, right? The brain detects negative information faster than positive information. And whenever a certain event or situation is flagged in our brain or our mind as negative, it's really stored carefully. So remember, our ancestors had a greater opportunity of surviving when they really paid attention to those negative experiences, right? And the book says like our brain is Velcro for negative experiences, so Velcro, it sticks, and then it's like Teflon for positive experience. So it takes greater effort for us to keep that positive experience. And I'll explain a little bit more how we can do that, start to bring more positive into our negative thinking or negativity bias that we have in our minds. And so because these negative events tend to have more impact than positive events, like for example, you can start to feel like feelings of helplessness or being incapable after a few failures, right? And it sometimes can become difficult to undo those feelings, even if you've had some success in certain things. Like the failures tend to be prevalent, which I don't even like to think of failure as failure. There is no failure. Like everything that happens is really feedback, I believe. Feedback for ourselves, like to improve, to become better, right? So there is no there is no failure. It's just feedback and an opportunity to learn, to grow, right? To experience more. And the book also talks about how we evolved and people will do a lot more to avoid a loss than to actually gain a comparable gain, or right, something positive. We'll do more to avoid something negative than get something positive. And another thing to note is that these negative experiences and this negative bias can kind of cause these vicious cycles in our mind, right? That can make us become either pessimistic or overreactive, or maybe even more inclined to be negative towards ourselves and have a negative self-talk. Because we have this built-in negativity bias in our brain, we are primed for avoidance, right? To avoid. And this negativity bias ultimately makes us suffer. It generates this like background sense of anxiety, which we all know that isn't pleasant. Who wants that? No, thank you. And then anxiety also makes it harder to bring our attention inward, right? For like self-awareness or even a contemplative practice like meditation. That's why sometimes meditation can seem so hard, right? You take a moment to sit like, okay, I'm gonna do this meditation, and our brain is just going haywire, which is totally normal, by the way. And like anything else, it takes practice. But that's totally normal. There's nothing wrong with you if that's happening, right? We evolved it this way. That's what I'm trying to explain with this. Because our brain, I guess, is always like scanning to make sure there's no problem or no threat, right? Negativity bias also can kind of intensify uncomfortable emotions, right? Like anger or sorrow or a deep sense of sadness or even depression, right? Feelings like guilt and shame. It highlights past losses or failures, and then it downplays present abilities, and I'm reading from the book here, and it exaggerates future obstacles. Emmy woke up, so I had to go get her. She's here now with me. But the book also talks about, they call it the simulator or virtual reality, and it talks about how our minds just constantly replay these negative past events, which I'm sure you've had it happen plenty of times. And it says that for our ancestors, running simulations of past events promoted survival, as it strengthened the learning of successful behaviors by repeating their neural firing patterns. Simulating future events also promoted survival by enabling our ancestors to compare possible outcomes. But then obviously we still do this today, right? And the problem with this, it says, like, number one, keep replaying and running in our minds these things take us away from the present moment. And they also base the future just on past events, which isn't good because the future is always full of new possibilities, you know, new ways to either communicate or have a relationship with people, new ways of accomplishing your goals and dreaming big. So it kind of says that when we are in this state, the beliefs are limited, right? We have these limiting beliefs, obviously, and it describes it as like just being in an invisible cage. It says too that it traps you in a life smaller than the one that you could actually have. And when we play these past experiences again and again, it strengthens the neural associations between an event and its painful feelings. So I guess the way they describe neural pathways happen in our brain, or the way that I understood it the best, is imagine a mountain, right? It rains, and the rain, how the water flows down, creates a little crevice. So the next time it rains, the water flows down through that pathway again, and it keeps making that crevice or that pathway even deeper and stronger until maybe it becomes a little creek, and maybe a big river, and maybe a big like gorge or canyon, right? This is the way that they described it, which made a lot of sense. This is what happens in our brains as well, and how our neural pathways are created. So say something negative happens and something else in the future happens that's positive, or that's not positive, negative also, and similar, it goes down that pathway again with whatever feelings that we felt in that moment. Obviously negative feelings, whether it was anger or sadness, making that pathway even stronger. The simulator also forecasts threatening situations into your future, but in fact, most of those situations actually never materialize, right? All those things that we're predicting in the future might happen that are terrible, and oh my god, if this happens, I'm gonna die, or whatever it is, like most of the times they end up not happening, and we're already here in the present moment suffering from thinking that those things might happen. A lot of times it ends up happening and is not as bad as we were imagining it. In all these ways how we evolved, it causes us ultimately to suffer, right? But what's beautiful and hopeful, I think, is that if it is our brain that causes us to suffer, then if we change our brain, we can change our life, right? How the book says. So what to do about all this? One is to always try to come back to the present moment, right? Because it's only in the present moment when you can feel true happiness and peace and love. The way to come back to the present moment, the easiest way and most simple and quickest, is to do deep breathing, right? To take a moment and just maybe put your hands on your heart, take a few deep breaths, and come back to the present moment. Or either maybe spend time with the people that you love, or doing something that you love. And then another important thing that the book mentions as far as a solution or what to do about this is to practice self-compassion, right? And it explains how self-compassion isn't really anything like self-pity or anything like that, but it's actually a powerful way of like increasing your self-worth, building resilience and confidence, and it also opens your heart. So ways to cultivate this self-compassion. One is to like remember being with someone that really loves you and just kind of really feeling that feeling inside of you of receiving care and like unconditional love. Another way is to bring to mind someone that you feel compassion towards. Maybe like a child would be somebody really easy, right? Another way is to extend then the same compassion to yourself. So be aware like of your suffering and then just extend loving kindness, compassion to yourself and kind of give yourself good wishes. And another way to combat this negativity bias and overall overall sense of anxiety is by practicing mindfulness, right? You want to say hi? By practicing mindfulness. And mindfulness is just using the attention to just with both like your body and your mind of what's happening internally and on your surroundings. So that coming back to the present moment is part of a mindfulness practice. So recap, if you tend to be negative or anxious, it is totally not your fault. You're not alone and there's nothing wrong with you. We evolved this way. We evolved having this negativity bias and being vigilant and anxious. And the ways to start practicing moving away from, being this anxious, negative self is by practicing mindfulness, being able to come back to the present moment, doing practices that bring you back to the present moment. And then the other important one is self-compassion, right? So mindfulness, loving kindness, self-compassion, loving kindness are the two keys to ultimately lead a more living a joyful, more positive, and fulfilling life, right?
And peaceful life.
And peaceful life, yeah. Before I say goodbye, I wanted to say 3 things. One is that you can support free yoga and all these conscious living resources by subscribing to my YouTube channel. Number 2, if you want to help others find this video, just share it with anybody that you think might benefit and enjoy this video. And you can either share it to family and friends via email or on social media, whichever you feel comfortable with. Number 3, if you haven't already, sign up to join my email list. I send an email every weekend, and what you can expect is either a short yoga class, a meditation, or just a real talk, real conversation like this with conscious living resources. And if you have like a special request of anything that you want me to dive deeper into, you can also submit a special request and I will personally make a video just for you. And the whole idea of like just providing all these conscious living resources and practices is to just support you in being your best self and ultimately living your best life. I hope you decide to join us, because in joining us, you're not just joining my email list, but you're also joining a community and a movement for a brighter future and a better world. I truly believe that. And so I personally welcome you and invite you. And I will see you next week. From my heart to yours. Thank you for being here. See you soon.